As darkness settled over wood and heath, tank number 8001 also withdrew from the battlefield back to the orchard, hiding out. In front, the last burning tank was signalling yet another unsuccessful attack. Once more, the push to the coast had been a flop. Hasn't it yet dawned on those chair-borne gentlemen way back that we are facing a powerful enemy here who can't simply be thrown back into the sea just like that? The skipper of one of the tanks asked. It was a question asked by many in the evening of June 9th, when it was obvious that a thrust to the coast was now out of the question, with the forces available to individual divisions. Obergruppenführer Dietrich, the general commanding the 1st SS Armoured Corps under his command, had been placed as the only army division ordered to prepare to defend the Tilly area. The line Christo-Verrier-la-Belle-Épine was to be held as the main front line at all costs. There was no more talk about counter-attacking to the coast. It was a turning point. Dietrich's order was undoubtedly correct. It became obvious that the main weight of the British offensive was being switched to the Tilly area. Since Montgomery had been unable, in spite of exceedingly heavy casualties, to capture by direct attack the important road centre of Kay, Montgomery drew the inevitable conclusion. If he could not achieve his objective by frontal attack, he must try to attack from the flank. This meant advancing from the Bayeux area to Tilly, gaining the high ground of Vier's Bocage, and then wheeling towards KH. A new chapter was opening in the Battle of the Invasion. Its name was Tilly. The battle for Tilly on June 9th, when the Panzer Lehr Division was thrown into the defensive battle for Tilly, was a challenge. This modern fighting unit, wholly designed for mobile armoured warfare, was faced with unexpected tasks. Its zone of operation was the beige, undulating ground crisscrossed by hedges, dotted with clumps of bushes, and interspersed with large apple orchards and pastures. It was not unfavourable terrain for defence. The high banks, with their bushes or lines of trees, parcelled up the landscape into hundreds of small rectangles, offering hiding places and cover. But they also made observation difficult. Infantry units were able to establish themselves in the many sunken lanes. In this way, the various defensive sectors could be set up in echelon. On the other hand, they had no contact with one another, and the answer to these problems was the tank. The tank became the hub of defence. A weapon designed entirely for attack, assault, and rapid advance became a means of defence. An armoured anti-tank gun or an armoured machine gun. This new use gave rise to an entirely new fighting technique, and also to a new type of fighter. The invasion battle was moulding tactics and fighting men no less than the battles of encirclement in the east or the improvisations outside Moscow. In the Dawn and on the Volga in Normandy, the individual tank became the nucleus of infantry units, the infantry platoon, the company, the combat team. They were all based on the tank. Without tanks, no position was taken, and without tanks, no position could be held. Local counterattacks against enemy penetrations, or for the recapture of tactically important ground, were almost invariably led by individual tanks. The Panzer Lehr Division, to whom Garrion had once overconfidently assigned the proud task of throwing the Anglo-Americans back into the sea single-handed, found itself forced into an entirely new mode of fighting. The division had been created as an elite unit for offence. Now it was being expended as a defensive unit. Its splendid fleet of 750 armoured and superbly armed infantry carriers had to be put in store. They were being kept at a depot 60 miles behind the fighting front. 750 armoured vehicles in armoured divisions engaged in static defence. It was an exciting but also a depressing chapter in the history of the war. The episode that follows is typical of many. 4 Mark IVs moved off noisily. Their skippers had only penciled sketch maps to go by. And the order? Position to be taken up along this road, tanks to be well camouflaged, a good field of fire to be ensured, sector must be held, make sure you get into position before you're spotted by fighter bombers. And then they were off. 5 men were inside the tank. Outside, the infantrymen were clinging to the turret like a cluster of grapes. Tanks advance hard to the right, use that bank for cover. Nobody suspected that their little outing would last a fortnight. 14 days and nights on outpost duty in the Label Epine area. It was like a game of Red Indians, only deadly serious, this business of hide-and-seek to evade the sharp eyes of the fighter bombers. Once a tank was spotted, it was done for mercilessly. It would be dive-bombed and attacked until a bomb or a volley of cannon fire had finished it off. The enemy's superiority could be met only by cunning. Corporal Westfall, the skipper of the tank, got out to reconnoitre along a sunken lane. He crawled through the hedges and inspected every inch of ground. He had moved up and down the lane about a dozen times. "You'd think he was choosing a building plot," Lance Corporal Hoffman, the wireless operator, said with a grin. "Well, that's what it comes to," said Hamer, the loader. "Better a building plot than a tomb," Schneider, the gun layer, agreed. At last, Westfall had found a spot to his liking. He reseated 2 men, who moved off in opposite directions. They found their 2 neighbour tanks in well-camouflaged positions. To the left, that of Corporal Schultz. To the right, that of Corporal P. Last in the line with the 4th tank was Captain Felmer. They were concealed in sunken lanes, in orchards and in haystacks. The infantrymen around them were camouflaged by bushes, sheaves of oats, and broken-off branches and twigs. The gaps between the tanks were rather wide. Even so, they had to try, in the event of an attack, to halt the enemy's armoured spearheads from their concealed positions. A mile behind them was the armoured reserve. If the outpost line was pierced, that reserve had to counterattack. The first few hours were spent in camouflage. Branches and twigs were carefully cut out of a hedge, and the tanks decorated with them until they seemed to have been spirited away. Time and time again, a man would go off to see whether the camouflage looked genuine. Then he would say, "A bit of the turret's still showing," or "A caterpillar lynx still glittering in the sun," and so on, until at last he was satisfied. "All right, now next." The tank tracks in the field of oats had to be obliterated, or they would be a clear signpost for any fighter-bomber. Laboriously, each blade was bent back again and made to stand upright. The first 2 days were tolerable. Water for washing and hot food were not yet missed. The men in the tank were not yet getting on each other's nerves. They still slipped cheerfully through the floor hatch and crawled out underneath the tank to replace the withered camouflage branches, or get a breath of fresh air. At night, inside the tank, 2 men stood or sat by the glass all the time, ceaselessly scanning the ground in front. What's the distance to that bushy-topped tree? There was some dispute and argument, then they agreed, and to that big bush in the hedge and to the far corner of the oat field. Mentally, they surveyed their whole field of fire. They became familiar with the distances. In an emergency, they would not have to spend long calculating. The time was 2 p.m. on their 3rd day. "Alarm, Tommies!" The men were galvanized into action. Lance Corporal Ross, the driver, had his eyes glued to the glass. 10 Tommies with a man-handled anti-tank gun. They're crossing the field now and they're taking up position. 2 men coming up with ammunition boxes. Is that shrapnel? The skipper ordered calmly, 400 metres, fire. The 75mm shell burst right in front of the anti-tank gun. 3 British soldiers were still alive and were now racing towards an apple tree with low-spreading branches. Turret 11 o'clock, fire! The top of the tree was torn to pieces. Fire! The tree trunk was shattered. Fire! There was nothing left but a tangle of smashed branches. Cease fire! They slid out through the floor hatch, rearranged their camouflage. They were looking serious and knew that things would soon be getting very hot for them. An hour later, the British artillery spotting plane was above them, circling around, searching. Then it came. At first, only a few roving guns did the ranging, but presently they were under concentrated fire. Hell was let loose. But it is not easy to hit a small tank in a big landscape. True, the field of oats was ploughed over, the hedge was torn to shreds. There was a continuous thumping against the sides of the tank, death knocking at the door. Shortly before sunrise, the shelling increased in pitch until it was a veritable hurricane. The outer plates and the additional armour along the sides were riddled like Swiss cheese. The blankets draped around the turret with their twigs and greenery had been swept off. Smoke shells paired visibility. The smoke screen outside was thickening. Visibility was less than 10 yards. Any moment now they would come. They could not see them, but they knew. Fire. The 4 steel fortresses on which depended a stretch of the main front line outside Tilly were no longer concerned with camouflage. Now it was a time for fighting. The turrets swivelled, the guns belched forth their shells, machine guns ticked. Infantrymen fired from their foxholes underneath the branches and from behind trees. Fire and steel were hurled into the smoke screen. Open hatch, a quick look through the binoculars. "The barrage is creeping forward, forward," said Westfall. Now the infantry would come. They were not to be endangered by their own gunfire. "Fire!" The ground shook. The branches along the bank waved as in a hurricane from the blast of the gunfire. The summer sun of Normandy had vanished among clouds of dust and smoke. Gradually the smoke screen dispersed. Where was the enemy? He did not come. 4 tank crews and a few dozen infantrymen heaved a sigh of relief. At once they set about replacing their camouflage. It was their 8th night. The skipper had just changed places with the gun layer to snatch a quick nap, his head resting against the eyepiece. Westfall dropped off immediately. "Pass the shell case over," the gun layer said to Ross. None of them laughed any longer when they heard the intimate noise. Then the floor hatch was opened and their makeshift chamber pot emptied. At the same moment there was a thud outside. Crash! They jerked up. Again, crash! That was not artillery fire. Those were the shells of tank guns. One of them burst quite close. "Start engine! Engage reverse! Full speed astern!" The skipper tried to get back into his seat, but it was impossible. "Are we still following the hedge?" They came to a halt beneath a massive spreading oak. Shells were bursting in its boughs. Branches came clattering down. The next tank in the line was firing. Once, twice, 3 times. Then silence. Had they finished off the Tommies, or had the Tommies merely made off? They could not ask because of the radio silence. The 13th day dawned over the bank and the hedge. The men felt as if they had been put through the mill. They could no longer bear to see one another or to smell one another. 13 days of hardly being able to stretch. 13 days without a drop of water to wash in. 13 days crowded together in a steel coffin. Only their watchfulness remained. Every day the skipper scanned the hedge through his binoculars, foot by foot. Now he was looking at a small bulge. Surely that bulge had not been there yesterday, and one twig there seemed a lighter green. He focused his glasses carefully. So that's it, a Tommy. For an instant he could make out the flat steel helmet under the camouflage mix. Where there's one, there are bound to be more. The gun layer ranged his gun on target. Karl Brett Schneider nodded. Load shrapnel. Fire! 40 metres, less. But now the barrel of an anti-tank gun emerged from the hedge. So that was it. They had better shoot accurately now. The tank rang with the noise of the last shot. 10 metres farther to the right. Can't you see the barrel? Now the British gun began to bark. It had aimed at the tank's muzzle flash. The shells swished close past the turret. Which of them would be faster? For once, Westfall's tank was lucky. On the following morning, in the grey light of dawn, they were relieved. Unless a man has spent 14 days and 14 nights in an evil-smelling tank on outpost duty, he cannot know the simple bliss of returning to base, digging himself a comfortable hole in the ground, chucking in some blankets, and then rolling up in them and going to sleep. From afar came the sound of gunfire, the bark and swish of the fighter-bombers' rocket shells. They did not care. They did not care the least bit, so long as they were not ordered to mount tanks for immediate counterattack. Tank skirmishes during the night of June 9th, 10th. The defence of the Tilly area was taken over by the unit of the Panzer Division, all of which had at last arrived. The outpost line was, at the same time, the main front line. It ran from Christaux, near the Caya Highway, via Tilly North and the chateaux of Verrier and Bernier, through Label Epine and Toral to Sanandeo and Anto. Thus, a line of no less than 10 miles had to be covered and held by a single division. Divisional headquarters were in a farmhouse at Semono. Because of the danger from fighter bombers, elaborate precautions were necessary. The radio transmitters had been set up a few miles away. This made it impossible for the enemy to pinpoint the headquarters by direction finding. During the day, no motor vehicle was allowed within a radius of 500 yards. All tracks and tyre marks had to be carefully obliterated, and only thus could a headquarters escape the attention of fighter bombers and of artillery directed by spotter aircraft. Only a few days previously, the higher commands had been taught a terrible lesson. On June 8th, Rommel, anxious to clarify the chain of command, had had General Von appointed commander of the entire sector east of the Dives as far as Tilly. With the 3 armoured divisions now available to him, the 21st, the 12th SS and the Panzer Lehr, he was at long last to mount the counter-attack to the coast. At last, the commanders in the field breathed. In the afternoon of June 9th, however, the general's headquarters in the Château of Lain, 4 miles northeast of Thierry Harcourt, was attacked by fighter bombers and wiped out by carpet bombing. The enemy had pinpointed the headquarters by direction finding of its radio traffic. The Chief of Staff, General von Dayans, and 12 staff officers were killed. General Van Guy and Major General Pemsel, the 7th Army Chief of Staff, now in command of a corps of the Federal German Army, escaped by a piece of good fortune. But the planned attack could not now be launched. It was the end of June before a new headquarters staff was set up, and the officers were ready to take over their duties. The land around Tilly did not favour defence by infantry. The grenadiers of the 1st and 3rd Companies of the 1st Battalion 9002 Regiment, for instance, had taken up positions on slightly rising ground shortly before dawn. 2nd Lieutenant Baumach had inspected the positions together with the battalion commander. He was not encouraged by what he saw. Because of the stony soil, the grenadiers were not able to dig in adequately, and were lying instead in quite shallow troughs, laboriously scratched out of the hard earth with only a few stones to protect their heads. Things got going towards 5 a.m. sudden, concentrated artillery bombardment. The hurricane of fire lasted 45 minutes. Unprotected, the infantrymen were lying among the hail of shells. It broke their nerve. A few men leapt to their feet and ran back. Others followed. The position was in danger of crumbling. Lieutenant Ritter stood up to check the panic. He rallied the men and led them forward again. Fortunately, the bombardment was not followed up by a charge. Just before noon, 5 tanks rumbled past the farmhouse where battalion headquarters were established. They looked like German Panthers. Then one of them halted. The turret was opened. The skipper looked at the conventional tactical sign marking the farmhouse as a battalion headquarters. The tank's barrel swung across. Crash! These were not German PPS, and now they were really in for it, unless there was last-minute help. 2nd Lieutenant Verrer, with his company of Panzerjägers, was in position near the farmhouse. A few days previously, some new self-propelled guns had been delivered to him. Here was his chance to test them. Within 15 minutes, he had shot up 3 of the 5 British tanks from his hidden position. The others got stuck. Their crews bailed out in vain. They tried to fight their way back to the battalion headquarters with pistols and submachine guns. After some of them had been killed, however, the remainder put up their hands. A 2nd lieutenant with a face wound turned to Baumach, saluted, and in precise school German declared, "I surrender." About this time, as 2nd Lieutenant Verrer was cracking the tanks of a Scottish regiment west of Tilly, General Boline, driving around the open plain north of Tilly, spotted a strong force of British tanks bivouacking in the most peaceful manner. "Hart Dagon, go and get anything you can find." The orderly officer dashed off. He mobilised 4 Panthers and 2 88 mm guns, that old wonder weapon which had ensured so many successes in Africa. Boline was in his element. He positioned his force at a favourable range, well camouflaged. Then he commanded, "Fire!" The British combat force was like a stirred-up anthill. The vehicles careered about in wild confusion. Boline's men smashed the shells from the Panther's rapid-fire guns and from the 88S. But the battle did not remain one-sided for long. The British blanketed Boleyn's force with one of their characteristic artillery bombardments, including naval guns. After all, they could afford it. The Panthers and the 88 guns had to disappear in a hurry. It was always the same. Cunning, gallantry, and even self-sacrifice invariably had to yield to superior power. In the evening, Lieutenant Colonel Z, the missing battalion commander in the Panzer Artillery Regiment, returned to Boleyn's headquarters together with Colonel Leuenberger and the NCOs and men of a patrol. He had been surprised by a Canadian tank detachment and taken prisoner. For no obvious reason, this Canadian detachment had behaved in the most brutal fashion. The violence and fanatical ferocity of the invasion battle, which led to excesses on both sides, had culminated here in a particularly ugly incident. During the general beating up of the German prisoners, Zeisler had slipped away into the undergrowth and had later made his way back to the German lines. His account was borne out in a horrible and deplorable fashion on the following day. The one-armed Colonel Leuenberger was found severely injured on top of a Canadian tank which had been knocked out by a German anti-tank gun. He had been tied to the turret. 3 days later, he died in a German field hospital. Cherry to lemon, come at once! The expected British full-scale offensive came on June 11th. It began with a powerful tank attack on Tilly. Captain Phillips, now a parson in Gladbeck, repulsed the British with units of the 9001 Panzer Grenadier Regiment. A second thrust was aimed at Verrières. Verrières was lost. British scouting cars were already emerging from the large patch of woodland north of the town, advancing towards the road and sneaking up through pastures, fields and orchards. The armoured reserve of the Panzer Regiment now mounted its counterattack. The steel colossi of panthers and tigers rattled through the narrow streets of Lèvres, screeching. They swung onto the secondary road outside the shell-wrecked church. They turned into a farm track and rumbled on towards a patch of wood about 300 yards away. "Action stations! Close hatches!" All they could see of the hedgerows and ditches of the fields and the edge of the forest was a narrow strip through the bulletproof glass which covered the vision slits. Both guns loaded, safety catches on. The gunlayer reported over the intercom that the machine gun and the long 75 flat trajectory gun were ready for action. Second Lieutenant Theo was a troop commander in the 6th Company and the skipper of the 3rd Tank, which bore the code name Lemon. Attentively he watched his front. Ahead of him, advancing in single file along the narrow farm track, were 3 tanks of the company. Now they turned left. They skirted the edge of the wood, rumbling past the tangle of tall hedgerows, clumps of shrubs, thick patches of undergrowth, and gnarled old apple trees. Second Lieutenant Theo was following them. Now the 3 tanks in front were burning across an open field into the wood. Instantly, hell broke loose. "Enemy armour, turret 11 o'clock." These were the commands Second Lieutenant Theo heard in his earphones. They were the orders of the skippers of the tanks ahead of him. A loud bang. Theo entered the open field, and now he could see what was happening. On the path leading into the woods stood a smoking Cromwell tank, shot up by Cherry. Billows of smoke rising behind the wreck suggested that other Cromwells, those new highly mobile British tanks, were withdrawing under cover of a smoke screen. Suddenly a Sherman burst from the hedge on the right, but immediately turned tail and vanished in the thick undergrowth. Theo sent a shell behind him. Almost at once he found himself under fire from the left. He turned his gun towards the outlines of a tank just visible behind a hedge. Direct hit. There was no movement from the direction of his victim. Evidently the crew had already abandoned the tank. The Panthers and Tigers stalked the enemy through the thick undergrowth, but opposition from the British was getting stronger. They were feeding reinforcements of tanks and anti-tank guns into the patch of wood. The commander judged correctly that his task was not to allow his tanks to be knocked out one by one in the treacherous thicket, but to prevent the enemy from taking the village of Lèvres. The battle swayed to and fro for days. Finally, it looked as if the British had given up the attempt. Lemon! Second Lieutenant Theo's tank had taken up a rest position in a farmyard on the village street. Corporal Morans was in the kitchen supervising the giant frying pan in which an enormous peasant breakfast of 15 eggs was being prepared for the 5 men. Abruptly, the village came under heavy bombardment. At the same moment, over Lemon's radio, which was left permanently switched on, there came a desperate call for help from Cherry. "Cherry to Lemon! I am surrounded by enemy infantry. I'm unable to move. Come at once. Lemon, repeat, come at once!" The peasant breakfast was flung into the sink. Blankets, haversacks, and personal kits were snatched up and tossed into the tank. Engines started. Out from under cover, they got their weapons ready for action. As the tank lurched out of the farmyard, everything was done automatically. They saw the trouble as soon as they reached the field track. Cherry, which had been on picket duty, was standing motionless by the hedge. British troops were all around the tank. Theo opened up at them with his machine gun, and another burst. The tracer struck the muddy ground right in front of the tank. The British infantry scuttled back to the wood, but now armour-piercing weapons were opening up on Theo from the edge of the wood. Undeterred, Theo's men got out of the tank under direct fire. They made fast the steel cable to Cherry. The troops' second tank was now coming out of the village and took over fire cover. It received a hit at once, but it continued firing. "The tow line is secure. Off steady now." Even so, the tow line snapped. From the edge of the wood, the enemy was firing as hard as he could, every time smack into the bank. "Why on earth don't they aim higher?" muttered the wireless operator of the broken-down tank, as, together with Second Lieutenant Theo, he pulled the steel hook over the towing hook off. Theo ran in front of the tank and directed the towing manoeuvre down the narrow field track and through the anti-tank barriers at the edge of the village. The battle for Livres was getting fiercer. The British were using phosphorus shells for the first time, which, in addition to their explosive effect, caused terrible burns from their 3-foot-high searing flames. In a counterattack against British tanks which had broken through the line, Cherry was finished for good. Lemon was also damaged. 2 more of the company's tanks were set on fire by phosphorus shells. The crews bailed out. They rolled over in the dirt to extinguish their burning uniforms amid the crash and roar of the artillery fire. The wounded were packed on top of the last still mobile tank. The injured grenadiers and tank crews were cowering on top of its stern. Most of them had severe burns. Many of them were naked because helpful comrades had torn the burning uniforms off their skins and thrown a blanket over their raw flesh. They were screaming with pain as they burned about on top of the tank close to the hot exhaust pipes. Their screams did not cease until the hypodermic needle blissfully entered their veins at the main dressing station. When General Bolini arrived at the flanking strongpoint of Sanandeo in the afternoon of June 12th, Lieutenant T.S., the commander of the division's escort company, produced for him 3 prisoners. Bolin was amazed to see that they belonged to the 7th British Armoured Division. They displayed the red jabot on their sleeves and on their captured vehicle, the DEI Chanel sign that Bolin knew so well from the African campaign. So Montgomery's desert rats, those tough and cunning desert fighters, had also turned up. This meant that except for the 51st Highland Division, all Montgomery's elite troops were now in Normandy. In the face of that evidence, the German High Command continued to doubt that the operations in Normandy represented the Allies' main blow. Bolin took the prisoners along in his Volkswagen Jeep to his headquarters for his intelligence officer to question them about the intentions of the 7th Armoured Division. Suddenly the general heard his orderly officer behind him roaring with laughter. "And what's so funny?" Hart Dagan, with a broad grin, pointed to one of the prisoners with a face like a horse. "Her gal, do you know who that is?" "How should I know?" Bolin grunted. "This man," Hart Dagan announced dramatically, "this man is the chief undertaker of a London cemetery." "A great pity," the general remarked. "A great pity. We've got other things to do. I should have enjoyed a chat with him." But instead, the intelligence officer had a long chat with him. The officer was, of course, interested not so much in the cemetery as in the undertaker's business as a member of the 7th British Armoured Division. The undertaker was a chatty man. He told his captors that the Desert Rats had already penetrated deep into the flank of the Panzer Division and were pushing farther and farther into the still empty gap between the British and American bridgeheads. "If that is so," the intelligence officer remarked, "then our situation is damned serious. If the Desert Rats get into the rear of our division, they may well cause our lines to collapse." The very next day, June 13th, confirmed his fears. While Montgomery was still battering against Tilly and Langres with tanks of the 50th Division, thus tying down Bolin's armoured reserves, a combat group of the 7th Armoured Division quietly slipped past Bolin's flank and penetrated as far as Villers-Bocage. The British advance was discovered by Obersturmführer Mikl Wittmann in a Tiger tank of the 2nd Company, SS Heavy Tank Battalion, 5001 Regiment. Wittmann, the company commander, was an experienced tankman. On the Russian front, he had knocked out 119 enemy tanks and held the Knight's Cross with oak leaves. The strong detachment of Tigers had been moved from the Bouet area via Paris to the invasion front on June 7th. The 2nd Company had been caught by fighter bombers near Versailles in the morning of June. One-rank SS troops equivalent to lieutenant. Since then they had moved only at night. On June 12th they had reached the neighbourhood of Villers-Bocage. The morning of June 13th had been set aside for servicing and maintenance. Bomb damage had to be repaired, and the transmissions overhauled after the heavy flogging they had suffered during the long journey. Meanwhile, Obersturmführer Wittmann set out with his old gun layer Obash to reconnoitre the ground. Emerging from a small patch of woodland, he noticed enemy tanks moving along the road towards Hill 213 north of Villers-Bocage. Carefully, Wittmann withdrew to the edge of the wood. He observed. He counted that was no reconnaissance detachment, that was an entire assault force, and it was moving into the rear of the Panzer Lehr Division. But what could a single Tiger tank do about it? Or, for that matter, the company's 4 other Tigers, the only ones Wittmann had still available for action after their forced march and the heavy bombing. But Wittmann was no ditherer. This was an occasion not for calculation, but for action. 1 Tiger against a whole brigade. A British armoured column was driving through Villers-Bocage. Though Wittmann did not know it, it was the spearhead of the 7th British Armoured Division, namely the 22nd Armoured Brigade and units of the 1st Infantry Brigade. Among them were the famous 8th Hussars, the 1st Tank Regiment, and the 5th Artillery Regiment. Through his binoculars, Wittmann could see that the British were meeting no resistance in Villers-Bocage. The supply units, which had been stationed in the little town, had been overwhelmed the day before. The bulk of the British force continued along the high road toward Ward's Hill 213 in the direction of C. It was a hazy day, and there were no fighter bombers or reconnaissance aircraft in the sky. Even so, the British were displaying an astonishing degree of unconcern. 1 motorised infantry company had stopped by the roadside. It was a company of the 1st Infantry Brigade. They acted as if they'd won the war already. Wittmann's gun layer grumbled. Wittmann nodded. "We're going to prove them wrong." Calmly, he issued his orders. As if by a thunderclap, the quiet of the morning was rent by the Tiger's 88 mm gun. The leading British tank, only 80 yards away, immediately went up in flames like a gigantic beast. The Tiger burst out of the wood and swung onto the road in top gear. It raced straight for the enemy column. Then it stopped, it fired, it moved on, it stopped again, it fired, it moved on. Wittmann drove past the armoured spearhead of the British brigade, shooting up the vehicles. Tanks, trucks, and armoured infantry carriers were all in a jumble. The way ahead was barred by the shattered and blazing tanks in front. Behind them, the half-tracked vehicles had closed up too much. Wittmann was pounding the vehicles with his gun and machine guns. All the half-tracks, as well as a dozen tanks of regimental headquarters and the reconnaissance company, were reduced to scrap. A Cromwell tank swung its turret round. Its 75 mm shell slammed against the armour plating of Wittmann's Tiger without inflicting any damage on the giant. The Tiger's 88 mm gun finished off the Cromwell. Gunfire was now also coming from Hill 213. It came from Wittmann's 4 remaining Tigers, which were knocking out the reconnaissance tanks of the 8th Hussars as they tried to give covering fire to their comrades. Meanwhile, the noise of battle had alerted the 1st Tiger Company. Hauptsturmführer Mobius moved off with 8 tanks which had been standing by. Together with Wittmann's tanks, he first outflanked and then broke into Villa Bocage and destroyed the Cromwell tanks still in the town. In vain did Major French, the commander of a British anti-tank detachment, try to avert disaster. One of his guns was firing out of a narrow side street. A Tiger swung towards it and rammed the house on the corner. The house collapsed. The gun was buried under the masonry. The Tiger merely shrugged off the rubble and the beams, and moving in reverse, rumbled back to the main road. Only one of Major French's guns scored a lucky hit. The track of Wittmann's Tiger was blown off, and the giant lay motionless. Wittmann commanded, "Bail out!" At the head of his crew, he fought his way back to his company. Mobius's tanks fought a running battle with British infantry in the township. The fighting surged through the narrow streets. The Tommies were resisting desperately from basement windows and doorways. They fired their bazookas and infantry weapons, not unlike the German Panzerfausts and Stug shells. The Tigers received direct hits and were burnt out. There was no time for their crews to escape. Furiously, their comrades swept through the streets. This engagement in Villa Bocage on June 13th remains one of the most spectacular episodes of the invasion battle. A dozen Tigers against an entire brigade against Montgomery's famous Desert Rats. In the British record of the war, the engagement appears as the Battle of Villa Bocage. The British chroniclers claim 7 Tiger tanks were destroyed. Evidently, they counted a few old Mark IVs left behind in Villa Bocage as Tigers, a pardonable mistake, since defeats and retreats all too easily lead to incorrect counting and inaccurate reporting on both sides. But the numbers did not matter. The main point was that Montgomery's armoured thrust into the rear of the Tilly line had been stopped by Michel Wittmann's Tigers. A dozen Tigers had won a battle. The British were still dazed by the pounding they had received from the tanks when, in the early afternoon, German infantry made a sudden charge against Villers-Bège from several sides. These were advanced units of General von Litz's 2nd Panzer Division, which was being moved into the area between the British and American invasion sectors in order to reinforce the Panzer-Lehr Division. Litz's infantry penetrated into the town from the south. From the north, a combat group of the Panzer-Lehr Division attacked with 2 88 mm guns and 3 field guns. Lieutenant Colonel Kaman Bolin's energetic chief of operations had realized the danger of the British flanking movement, hurriedly scraped together various rearward formations, and personally led them into an attack against the British. Street fighting in Villers-Bège continued until the evening of June 13th. Then the British abandoned the battlefield, withdrawing the remnants of their battered units to Lee. But they did not salvage much. The entire headquarters personnel, as well as a company with 27 tanks and all the tracked and wheeled vehicles of the armoured brigade, were lost. The brigadier, 15 officers, and 176 other ranks had been killed. The 1st Infantry Brigade left 4 officers and 60 other ranks on the battlefield. Montgomery's plan had not been confined to the attack by the 7th Armoured Division. The flanking thrust at Carr was linked with a direct attack on the Tilly line. This was to tie down Bolin's forces and thus divert them from the outflanking manoeuvre of the 7th Armoured Division. It was this flanking movement against the rear of the Panzer-Lehr Division which was to have been the main blow, bringing about the collapse of the German front. Now that the action at Villa Bocage had ended in failure, Montgomery had to try to convert the pinning down operation at Tilly into a breakthrough. After a tremendous preliminary artillery and aerial bombardment, the 50th British Division, reinforced by new armoured units, launched its full-scale attack in the morning of June 15th. The main brunt was borne by Captain Phillips, the defender of Tilly, with units of 9001 Panzer Grenadier Regiment. He repelled all attacks on the town. There was furious hand-to-hand fighting. It was a battle decided chiefly by the Panzerfaust, that new weapon of the Grenadiers, the Mark 42 machine gun and hand grenades. Tilly was held, but Lannev was lost. Label Epin, though stubbornly defended by an armoured reconnaissance unit under Major von Feuer, likewise fell. On the following day the battle moved to its climax. The men of the Panzer-Lehr now heard the noise of battle on their right flank too, in the Puto-Bru area held by the 12th SS Panzer Division. The British were attacking. It was their 49th Division. On June 16th, the British crossed the Tilly-Balleroy Road on a broad front. Strong detachments captured Hot on the Kont Road. The situation was getting dangerous. General Bolin was then at the headquarters of the 9002 Regiment, in whose sector the enemy had made his penetration. The 1st Battalion Panzer-Lehr Regiment, subordinated to the 9002, was under the command of Major Morawski. He was ordered to retake Hot. By line, ordered, the Major had not even waited for the order, but had at once alerted his battalion to prepare for a counterattack. After a brief preliminary bombardment, 15 Panthers rumbled off with grenadiers riding on top. Morawski was right in front. Furiously the long barrels thundered, the machine guns chattered, and the anti-tank guns barked. By nightfall, Morawski had dislodged the British and retaken Hot. He himself was seriously wounded. Casualties among the grenadiers were heavy. Dusk fell, and the ghost-like ruins of Tilly towered into the sunset of June 16th. Without pause, the 50th and 49th British divisions were charging the cornerstones of the German front, as if there was nothing more important in all the world than to capture these bombed-out, gutted villages. V1S streaked over the front at the very moment when the British were battering the defences of Tilly and Cristo. The German High Command suddenly struck at London. Britain's metropolis was in utter confusion. Air raid sirens were wailing ceaselessly. Mysterious unmanned missiles were streaking through the air from the Dunkirk area at a speed of nearly 400 miles per hour and bursting in or outside London. The V1 had arrived. The rocket age had begun. A few minutes after midnight on June 15th, 16, Hitler had unleashed his latest Hound of Hell, 24 feet long, with a short wingspan of 16 feet, plain and squat. Such were the fire-belling monsters, which carried a ton of high explosive. For the first time in their history, the British found their capital under bombardment from the continent. The attack did not take them by surprise. All along, the British Secret Service had been fairly well informed about the progress of German long-range rocketry research and the development of the Vi-1. On August 17, 1943, the British struck. A force of 500, 97 aircraft attacked Punda, the centre of V-1 production. The effect was catastrophic. When the bomber fleet made off, the dead bodies of 735 men, including a number of leading technicians, were littering the wrecked site. Production was thereupon switched to the Harz Mountains, some of it to underground bomb-proof factories. But Churchill's Secret Service discovered the move and remained currently informed about progress. The first V-1 was to have been launched in December 1943. However, British intelligence located the launching ramps and smashed 35 of them with 3,000 tons of bombs. The next German date was February 15, 1944, but the ramps were smashed again. Eventually, Lieutenant General Ernst Heinemann scheduled the beginning of the V-1 offensive for the night of June 12, 13. Colonel Wakel, the commander of 155 Terabytes Flak Regiment, which was in charge of the V-1 operation, had misgivings. He wanted a few more tests on the steering mechanism, but Heinemann stuck to his date. That this date was anything but a secret is shown by the fact that a day previously, on Sunday, June 11th, the planned operation was known in London. In the morning of June 12th, the acting head of the British Secret Service informed the senior commands of the Royal Air Force that the employment of the V-1 was imminent. Meanwhile, Colonel Wakel's gunners worked feverishly. The first salvo was scheduled for 20 minutes before midnight, but firing had to be postponed to 3:30 a.m. At last, shortly before 4 a.m., the first 10 V-1S roared off their ramps, but it was a very unlucky start. 5 of them exploded immediately after takeoff, and the rest only just managed to get across the channel. General Heinemann at once called off the operation and postponed the offensive to the night of June 15th, 16. This time all went well. The snorting monsters roared off 55 ramps. By daybreak, 73 V-1S had burst in the area of the British south coast. A gloomy and anxious House of Commons heard the Home Secretary report about the attack of malignant robots. The German High Command, however, placed all its hopes in the new wonder weapon, the Retribution Weapon No. 1, previously referred to in the blueprints as 51003, or under the code item of Cherrystone. Hitler intended to break Britain's fighting morale by a relentless bombardment of her capital. He believed he could wear down the British government into surrender. That was why he refused and continued to refuse, even in mid-June, to direct the first rocket in military history against the concentrations of invasion ships off the Normandy coast or against the embarkation ports in southern England. There, the new weapon might have had military effects. It might have disrupted Allied supplies, or possibly even cut them off. At least the Allied naval units would have been forced to withdraw from the French coast, which would have eliminated the murderous naval bombardment that was ceaselessly pounding the German defences from 640 barrels. A V-1 bombardment of the landing beaches would anyway have had a severe psychological effect, especially as the Allied forces in the field were known to be sensitive to artillery and aerial bombardment. But no, London was to be softened up instead. It was a fatal miscalculation on Hitler's part. The total absence of German operations against the enemy fleet off the invasion coast was ironically emphasised by the sudden concentrated fire which British naval guns opened on the divisional headquarters of the 12th SS Panzer, 17 miles southwest of KH, on that very June 16th, the day that saw the opening of the V-1 offensive. Sturmann Hans Matisse, a driver attached to divisional headquarters, had just driven Grenfara's second Witz command car into the forecourt of the chateau after some minor repairs to it, when an artillery spotter aircraft passed overhead at great altitude. "I don't like the look of him," the Sergeant Farah said to Matisse. They both grabbed their mess kits and ran across to the field kitchen to collect their midday meal. After all, one never knew. But the British artillery spotter's radio was even faster. Like a tornado, the first salvo roared through the air. Heaviest naval caliber, 200 yards behind the chateau, the shells came down. A wall of fire and dirt rose up as high as a house. Then silence. Then came the second salvo. The gable of the chateau crumbled and crashed down. Officers and other ranks came tumbling out of the doors and leapt into the anti-shrapnel slit trench, which had been cut right across the forecourt. Grupp and F, the divisional commander, had just reached the trench. He glanced back to make sure none of his men had been left lying injured when he saw Matisse pressed against the outside wall. He shouted across to him, "Over here! Matisse, into the trench!" Matisse raced across like a sprinter. The third salvo was coming over. He tripped and fell headlong into the trench. Now Witt jumped in himself, and then everything was swallowed up in noise, fire and smoke. Private of SS troops, rank equivalent to Lieutenant General, when Matisse had dug his way out from underneath the rubble and dirt, the first thing he saw was the dead body of his divisional commander. The effect of the 16-inch shell was indescribable. It had burst right on the edge of the trench. Matisse staggered among the dead bodies. He took another step and then dropped into the vast void of unconsciousness. This disastrous incident demonstrated the terrible threat which the heavy naval guns represented to the fighting line and to headquarters. But Hitler could not make up his mind to use the V-1 against the fleet. He continued to put his hope of political results above the most pressing military requirements. Admittedly, the V-1 bombardment was beginning to unnerve the Londoners. Service mail captured by the 84th Corps conveyed a good idea of the morale in England. An assistant in a department store, for instance, described to her fiancé the scene in London during the opening days. Almost noiselessly, her account ran. Little airplanes, the missiles come gliding over. They burst first in one place, then in another, scattered all over London, and make large craters. Buildings collapse. It's terrible. Another letter revealed the emergence of a general sense of insecurity. Extensive areas of central London were being evacuated. One woman correspondent gave us her new address, a small town on the Tee near the Scottish border. The British public was demanding that the danger should be eliminated by the capture of the launching sites. Highly critical remarks were being made about the inch-by-inch offensive. For once, the placid English were grumbling quite a lot. Hitler, however, refused to see that the V1 offensive, if only because of their inadequate numbers and their insufficient accuracy against specific targets, would never induce a resolute British government to ask for terms. Even on June 17th, the date of his first and last visit to the invasion front, he still believed that the V1 bombardment of London could decide the war. Again, he declined to use the weapon against the English south coast ports. It was incomprehensible. Rommel warned and Rundstedt warned, but Hitler viewed the situation optimistically. "We only have to keep our heads," he assured the marshals. As for the situation on the Russian front, he believed that there was no serious danger there. "Hold the enemy in the east, defeat the enemy in the west," was Hitler's strategy. "If we ward off the invasion, Britain will sue for peace under the effect of the V weapons." But even while Hitler tried to inspire his marshals with this thesis, the first explosive charges were already being detonated in Russia on roads, bridges, railway tracks, and supply depots. With these explosions, the Soviet partisan detachments were ringing up the curtain on the Russian summer offensive. On the central sector of the Eastern Front, 4 days later, this offensive burst forth on both sides of the Smolensk-Minsk supply artery and caused the collapse of the line held by Army Group Center. Where are our airmen? In the early hours of June 18th, the troops in their foxholes on the Tilly front were woken up by a tremendous concentrated artillery bombardment. The earth was shaking. Then came 2 British divisions of the 8th British Corps, reinforced by newly landed armoured brigades. Under cover of the naval guns' creeping barrage and the aerial bombardment, the British attacked. The first wave broke against the ruins of Tilly. All day long, fighting raged around the shattered walls. In the evening, they were lost. Cristo was lost also, but the enemy had not yet broken through. The main line withdrawn behind the ruined towns was still intact. Again and again, each yard of ground was contested in bloody hand-to-hand fighting. Again and again, there was concentrated shelling, fighter-bomber attacks, and aerial bombardment. Casualties were mounting. It was only a matter of time before the Panzer-Lehr Division and the 12th SS Panzer Division would be annihilated. The ceaseless artillery bombardment and the continuous waves of aerial attacks would slowly but surely wipe them out. Whenever enemy aircraft streaked low over their positions, whenever bomber squadrons droned overhead in formation, the wretched troops would curse, grumble, or groan in despair. Where on earth are our airmen? And where is that damned Luftwaffe? To this day, former participants in the invasion battles find their hackles rising when they think back to those days. They felt let down by the German Luftwaffe, betrayed and sold out. It was a rare event even to see a single German fighter or bomber anywhere over the front. But then, what could the German airmen take up there? There is an illuminating passage in a secret analysis of the invasion battle submitted to the chief of the Luftwaffe General Staff. The second fighter group had an average of 30 machines available, but there were days when, of the entire GES, only 8 machines were operational. The majority of the fighter aircraft not operational could have been readied for action within 48 hours, provided the necessary spares had been available. But these had been withdrawn from depots in western France because of the priority given to the fighter defence of the Reich, and with what results? These too are mercilessly exposed in the report. We read, for instance, the air officer commanding 3rd Air Fleet reports ground installations being systematically smashed, especially all fighter fields. The Chief of Operations of 3rd Air Fleet reports enemy carpet bombing raids by 4 engine formations, at first only in daytime, but now also by night, especially against transport installations. The ratio of air strength generally was 1:20, during major operations about 1:40. The 2nd Fighter Corps reports own fighter operations now only conditionally possible. Effective reconnaissance and fighter operations were entirely ruled out in the invasion area. 30 Anglo-American airfields were already constructed and operational in the bridgehead. It was complete surrender in the air. The German Luftwaffe in the west was a neglected, broken tool. Here was the main reason for the German defeat on the invasion front. But does this mean that the Luftwaffe command can therefore be exempted from all responsibility? Was there no opportunity for improvisation? We have before us another report of the Luftwaffe command compiled from the most important operation logs, accounts of experience and analyses. This attaches much importance to the German failure to carry out large-scale aerial mining of the sea along the invasion coast. It says it has been shown in both world wars that close mine barrages, even in the open sea, restrict the operations of naval forces and the movements of shipping, diverting them into definite areas. In the Second World War, minefields planted from the air outside ports and inlets proved to be even more effective obstacles to the enemy, entailing a considerable effort in terms of mine clearance. It may therefore be safely assumed that a large-scale strategic and tactical program of mine infestation from the air would have been a considerable deterrent to an invading enemy. Our weak air forces in particular could have given considerable support in this way to our defensive forces at the moment of invasion. Mining of approaches would have had to be done as a strategic measure. It would have needed to be applied over a considerable period in all areas where the enemy might have been expected, or where coastal defences and troop concentrations were less strong. A thick mine barrage would have greatly interfered with the movement of transports and warships. The accurate intervention of Allied battleships in the ground fighting around Cherbourg would have been made considerably less effective, and the defence generally, as well as the preparations for a counterattack, would have been greatly facilitated. The report finally points out that the sweeping of a close mine barrage laid from the air, which would have required a considerable effort by Allied naval units, would moreover have been an important indication of where the main blow of the invasion might be expected. The Luftwaffe command failed to grasp this task. Thus, while it may have been the innocent victim of a mistaken and inadequate defence policy, it must nevertheless be found guilty of a great many mistakes of its own. But then, in war, misfortune frequently becomes guilt, just as honour and glory are often no more than a free bonus of good fortune. The battle for Cherbourg, Operation Heinrich, where Major Friedrich Wilhelm Coopers, the commander of Artillery Group Montebourg, had his battle headquarters, was well camouflaged. The date was June 19th. Coopers was sitting on a stool in his well-camouflaged tent, his map table and artillery board on his knees. The Americans had brought up 4 divisions to force their breakout from the Utah bridgehead to the north and west. Coopers glanced up as the flap of his headquarters tent was pushed aside. In the opening, haggard from lack of sleep, smeared with blood and dirt, stood Lieutenant Stark of the 5th Battery, 1262 Army Coastal Artillery Regiment. He had come from the observation post on Hill 117. Coopers was prepared for bad news. "What's up, Stark? Just look at yourself." In spite of his wound, Lieutenant Stark made a precise report. The enemy tank attack at the level crossing was stopped by our gunfire, but the Americans then made a surprise thrust along a sunken lane right into the little wood of Montebourg. Armoured units are pushing past the town centre on both sides. The infantry, which followed in their wake, is now being engaged in fierce fighting by the grenadiers of Combat Group Berg, which is holding the town centre, and by units of Combat Group Hoffmann. "Things are looking ugly," Stark concluded his report. Then he added, "If we are lucky, the penetration can be sealed off. Otherwise, we're in the trap. We'll have to get out of here, Herr Major, or else we'll be bagged by the Americans." Major Coopers regarded his lieutenant. He's right, of course, he thought. But Quenneville-Montebourg was the last position barring the road to Cherbourg, which had no proper landward defences. Once that position was breached, there would be no hope for Cherbourg. Now every order had insisted. If Montebourg falls, the road to Cherbourg will be open. Montebourg must be held. Mentally, Coopers reviewed the past 8 days. On June 12th, he had assumed command of the newly organised artillery group formed for the defence of Montebourg, from 5 batteries of different artillery units. Its 19 guns included 4 122 mm guns, 2 105 mm guns, and one 150 mm self-propelled gun, together with Flak Group Koenig and with Major Rasner's batteries of the 100th Mortar Regiment. It represented considerable firepower. Its purpose was to give support to the 919th Grenadier Regiment, which had been in action ever since June 6th and had now been forced back to the edge of Montebourg, and to the combat groups Hoffmann and Müller of the 243rd Infantry Division. The battle for Cherbourg had thus in fact begun. For a naval port or any fortress must be defended in the forefield. This lesson was borne out by every single landing operation from North Africa to Sicily and Italy, and it had been proved even earlier by the fall of Singapore. But the artillery commanders had waited in vain for the guns, which were not needed in the west and north of the Centon Peninsula, to be switched to its eastern coast so that the American bridgehead could be hammered and smashed by concentrated fire. But Garion's slogan, "Not driblets but mass," was being disregarded in the artillery too. Available resources were scattered about in driblets. The fear of further Allied landings, a fear nurtured by the German High Command and now haunting many headquarters, resulted in half measures or less than half measures. One battery would be sent to one place and a couple of guns to another to oppose enemy armour. At Montebourg, at long last, things were to be different. Here, the German units containing the Utah bridgehead units locked in exceedingly hard fighting were to be given a really solid artillery backing. This backing was to be provided by Cooper's group, and indeed its batteries were firing to capacity. The Americans were beating their heads against the wall of Montebourg, the gore hill of La Perelle, and Quinville. During the day, Cooper's maintained what he called cunning fire, highly concentrated fire of very short duration so as to make things difficult for the enemy's aerial spotting, sound ranging, and muzzle flash observation. At night he laid on sprinkling fire, a kind of harassing fire with all guns firing simultaneously as a concentrated salvo, but each gun at its own separate pinpoint target. This method yielded good returns both materially and psychologically. The Americans were nervously probing the whole neighbourhood with artillery and naval guns. Spotter aircraft were continually flying to and fro over the lines of the combat groups and their hinterland. The moment they spotted anything that looked like a gun position, hell was at once let loose. But the gunners had become experts at camouflage. The gun positions were real masterpieces of blending into the background. Any artilleryman vastly prefers a well-camouflaged mobile field position to a static pillbox. Those blocks of concrete only limited one's field of fire. They could not really be concealed. They were ready-made conspicuous targets and, at the same time, did not provide complete protection against bombs or naval guns. They were, in fact, coffins for the guns and their crews. The artillerymen in the field positions lay in one-man foxholes, just like the grenadiers of combat groups Müller, Kiel, Berg, and Hoffmann in the main line farther forward. Thus, even the heaviest bombardments could survive. To do any damage, a shell would have to strike right into a foxhole, and that happened very rarely. After all, a one-man foxhole was very small, and, what was more, it was almost completely invisible from the air. During the day, everybody remained under cover. Supplies, spares, ammunition, food, all these came up at night. The men became experienced night walkers. This cooperation between infantry combat groups and concentrated artillery, directed in a modern manner, proved exceedingly successful at Montebourg. Although the enemy was attacking with 3 divisions, the line held and the coastal roads to the north and northwest remained barred. Farther south, however, things went wrong. Major Coopers recalled the dramatic telephone conversations he had had on June 16th and 17 with his regimental commander, Colonel Reiter, on whose staff was also Lieutenant Professor Walter Hallstein, now the chairman of the European Economic Community. "The Americans have broken out to the west from their bridgehead," Reiter had told him. "It is quite true. With 2 divisions, Major General Collins had thrust to the west, traversed the picturesque Du Valley, crossed the river, and captured the battered little town of Saint-El-Vicomte. An important bridgehead had thus been established. But worse was to follow. General Helmy's combat group, with the 77th Infantry Division, newly brought up from Brittany, was unable to halt the Americans' breakout from their beach or to iron out their new bridgehead. The 9th United States Infantry Division and units of the 82nd United States Airborne Division were pressing towards the western coast in an attempt to cut the Cotentin Peninsula in half, split up the German forces there, and cut Cherbourg's overland communications to the south. General Collins's manoeuvres succeeded. The Americans reached the western coast at Barneville. Thus, an American corridor had been established in the warfield of Cherbourg across the peninsula, and compelling the German forces of the 84th Corps to establish a northern and southern defensive front. One operation that stands out from the general disaster of the collapse of the German defensive front west of Utah Beach is the 77th German Infantry Division's breakthrough to the south, right across the American line. Units of this division, under General Stegmann, were to have covered the right flank of Scharn's. Stegmann had just been discussing the details with Scharn in the afternoon of June 17th when the order came through. Disengagement towards the south. Stegmann was not sorry. He did not believe that Scharn's landward front could possibly be held by exhausted troops, nor did he think very much of the idea of falling back on Cherbourg as a fortress in the long run. He was perfectly right. General Stegmann therefore tried to lead his division to the south as fast as possible in battle-worthy groups through the enemy front. However, the exhausted units of the division were intercepted by fighter bombers near the village of Brickbeck in the early morning of June 18th. There was terrible confusion. Stegmann was driving down the road trying to bring order into the chaos. Just then, a fighter bomber swooped down and opened fire on the general's car. The 20 mm shells tore straight into the vehicle. The general was killed instantly, the fourth general to be killed in action on the invasion front. On the day before, General Helleck, the commander of the 243rd Infantry Division, had lost his life in similar circumstances. He too had been struck and instantly killed by a 20 mm shell. Death by fighter bomber was what the men called it in the front line. General of Artillery Marx, the exemplary and popular commander of the 84th Corps, had also bled to death in a roadside ditch west of St. El on June 12th, after being shot up by a fighter bomber. Command of the 77th Infantry Division was taken over by the division's senior regimental commander, Colonel Baker, officer commanding 1149th Infantry Regiment. He summoned the unit commanders to a conference. What's to be done? Give up, some suggested. Fall back to the north into Cherbourg Fortress, advised others. But Baker asked, are 1,500 to 2,000 men to go into captivity at a time when, down in the south, every rifle is needed for the establishment of a new line of resistance? The columns moved off during the night of June 18th and 19. They were making for the south. Captain Dr. Sri Hugger, the intelligence officer, gives the following account of the phantom march of the 77th through the American front. The few Volkswagens and radio vans that were still intact sneaked through the enemy lines in dread secrecy. In the grey light of dawn, the marching columns were passing through enemy-occupied villages. The American sentries got quite a fright when they saw the silent processions and were quickly disarmed. They joined the marching columns as prisoners. "Keep moving!" The signals detachment dismantled and neatly coiled up the wires of American telephone connections, partly to cut the enemy's communications and partly to help themselves to badly needed material. A thick cloud cover and fine drizzle provided protection against fighter bombers. Towards 11 a.m., the force camped in a sunken lane. Patrols sent out to reconnoitre the immediate neighbourhood discovered an American field encampment less than 500 yards away. But the men simply could not march another step. It had to be risked. "Not a sound," was the order. "Rest for sleeping." The men dropped in their tracks on the banks of the sunken lane. Sentries lay on the ground, their eyes glued to binoculars. Would the Americans spot them? They did not. In the late afternoon, they moved on. Colonel Baker had a radio signal sent to the units of the 243rd Division lying to the south beyond the American corridor. "We are pushing towards Viot. Let us pass through your blocking position. Can you help us by counterattack?" Presently, a handful of self-propelled guns of the 243rd Division punched a clear passage through Vau for the 77th. But when they got to the little river Owend, it looked as if all their efforts had been in vain. The crossings were blocked by a strong American position. Baker was not going to give up. With success almost in sight, now they would have to fight for it. The 1st Battalion, 150th Infantry Regiment, charged against the enemy-held bridgehead in the old-fashioned manner, with fixed bayonets under cover of a light machine gun. They took the bridge, smashed the 2nd Battalion, 47th United States Infantry Regiment, and took a large number of prisoners with all their wounded. With 250 prisoners and 12 captured jeeps, the regiment reached the German lines. All this, of course, Major of Artillery Friedrich Wilhelm Küppers, in his well-camouflaged hog pen north of Montabaur, did not yet know on the morning of June 19th. But he did know that the Montabaur sector was hanging in the air, and a sector was not just a stretch of land. The grenadiers of combat groups Hoffmann, Kiel and Müller in their forward foxholes, the 19 guns of his 5 batteries, and the guns of the 30th Flak Regiment, Major Rasner's mortars, and the anti-tank troops of the 79th Panzer Division under Captain Hummerich, this entire force was in German army parlance hanging in the air. Its flanks were unprotected, and it was apt to be bagged by the enemy at any moment. Küppers knew that Lieutenant Stark, standing in front of him, was quite right when he said, "We've got to get out of here, Herr Major. We're in a trap." Küppers called for his driver, Corporal Johann C. "Have we got any brandy left for the lieutenant? He's earned a drink." Coke produced a bottle. There was about 2 fingers left in it. The aluminum beaker would have to do for a glass. "Thank you, Herr Major," Stark smiled. He raised his stubbly chin and knocked back the drink. "Has Operation Heinrich not yet been ordered, Herr Major?" he asked. "No, our orders are to hold out." Operation Heinrich was the secret code name for the withdrawal into the fortified area of Cherbourg. Once the Americans had broken through at St. and pushed across to the western coast of the Cotentin Peninsula, Jean's right wing was no longer covered. 7th Army, therefore, planned to withdraw these forces to the landward front of Cherbourg. Unless this was done, there was a danger that the Americans might swing north from the western coast, cutting off those of Jean's forces which stood at Montabaur. To avert this danger, and also to keep the initiative, a gradual withdrawal was to be carried out sector by sector upon the order. But when the Führer's headquarters learned of the plan, Hitler flew into a rage and strictly forbade any withdrawal. Whatever the present positions are, they are to be held at all costs, was the familiar order. But reality proved stronger. At any rate, Jean's front had already been torn open to the west, so there was nothing left to hold. Rommel had remonstrated with Rounet by telephone, and Rounet had explained to Hitler the gravity of the situation. Thereupon his decision had been amended. The fortress of Cherbourg is to be held at all costs. A fighting withdrawal of units to the south of it is authorized, provided the enemy's advance is slowed down. Withdrawal in one single movement is forbidden. The officers commanding the smaller units were suitably instructed. Now their responsibility was weighing heavily upon them, for translated into the plain language of the fighting front, the order demanded holding out until further resistance is impossible. Only then, at the very last moment, may you withdraw under irresistible enemy pressure to avoid capture. But when was this last moment? How would they recognize it if they had no idea of the situation on the next sector? To meet the local conditions and to clarify chains of command, the German forces were reorganized. The 79th Division and the 922nd Grenadier Regiment of the 243rd Division were formed into a battle group Cherbourg and taken out of the 84th Corps. Thus, responsibility for the Cherbourg area rested entirely with General von Schlieben. In his account of his anxieties, he says, "I remember fairly accurately a signal sent to me by Field Marshal Rommel, and it certainly did not suffer from any lack of suggestions. Roughly, it ran like this. Jean's group will hold out in front. It will retire only under heavy enemy pressure. It will not allow the enemy to outflank it. It will deceive the enemy by resourceful operations, and it will reach the landward front in good time. Yet all I had was an entirely battered division with horse-drawn transport and almost immobile, while the enemy was far better and more generously motorized than even our armoured formations were at the beginning of the Russian campaign. The enemy, moreover, had an air force which prevented all movement during daytime. Another order, Scharn's account continues, pointed out that in accordance with the latest orders from Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the line was to be held at any price. This meant a barrier across the entire northern half of the peninsula. Yet another radioed signal demanded that not only the landward front, but the Jorg Peninsula in the northwestern corner had also to be held at all costs. The same demand was moreover made with regard to the hills at Brix. I had the impression that the High Command had stopped using a map or dividers. The road network on the Senton Peninsula was so extensive and so superbly engineered that a mobile motorized force could quite easily bypass any local opposition. On paper, I had been given a free hand, but in reality orders were piling in one on top of another. Thus it came about that because of this kind of hold-on order, the grenadiers and artillerymen were still lying in their foxholes in the Montebourg area on June 19th, although on the western side of the peninsula American tanks were already moving towards Cherbourg. Let us return again to Major Cuppers in his hog pen north of Montebourg. Cuppers picked up the telephone and talked to the combat group headquarters. "First, we've got to seal off the penetration," was their opinion. "Otherwise we're dished." Cuppers therefore commanded concentrated fire on the various penetration points. The batteries started roaring, the mortars started lobbing their salvos, and a miracle happened. The artillery bombardment and the mortar salvos made the Americans hesitate. They suspected stronger forces than were in fact available, and they shrank from the risk of pushing on. But how long could they be fooled? Towards midday, a telephone connection with division was restored by mere chance. While mending a line severed by gunfire, the signallers had come across the wire leading to General von Scharn's headquarters. Major Forer, the intelligence officer of Scharn's 79th Division, was startled. "You're still there? We thought you'd moved back during the night." At that point the line was cut again. Half an hour later, an avalanche of bad news began to pour into Cuppers' headquarters. The catastrophe was beginning to take shape. Captain H's unit of Panzerjägers had lost so many anti-tank guns that the right flank could no longer be protected. Lieutenant Kigg, the liaison officer with the 30th Flak Regiment, reported that the gun placements were all noticing the approaching noise of battle and finding themselves under fire from mortars and tanks. Lieutenant Estitz, commanding the 1st Battery of the 179th Artillery Regiment, reported from his observation post on top of the Hooberville Church Tower. American armoured units are forming up for attack on both sides of Montebourg. The 4th United States Division thrust into the open right flank of the German positions, while the 79th Division advanced towards Montebourg, its tanks bypassing the town centre and reaching the roads to Wallonia. Again, Major Cuppers rang through to the commanders of those combat groups to whom he had still a line. Lieutenant Colonel Hoffmann, Major Rasner, and Lieutenant Schmidt had just turned up at his hog pen. They had been shelled out of their headquarters north of the Montebourg-Wallonia road. What was to be done? Should they allow their flank to be rolled up and themselves to be cut to pieces, and should they surrender, or should they retreat, which meant that they would be at the mercy of the fighter bombers? The heavens were merciful. A gale-force wind sprang up, driving low clouds before it. A fine drizzle began to fall. This was the kind of weather they needed. Here was a chance of escape from their trap. Once more their guns thundered and their mortars screamed. The ammunition they could not take with them was used up against the penetration points, simulating a counterattack. This ruse enabled the combat groups to detach themselves from the enemy unnoticed. The difficult operation was brought off. Even the grenadiers in the town centre pulled out unnoticed. In accordance with orders, no withdrawal into the fortress in one movement was carried out, but an intermediate line was taken up in the Law area. At 6:30 p.m, the combat groups were again in position, their guns ready for action. Only a soldier who has experienced for himself the kind of continuous fighting undergone by these men can appreciate the degree of discipline, obedience, and courage implied in the simple phrase, "again in position." On the following day, the combat groups of Montebourg were incorporated into the landward defences of Cherbourg. The curtain was going up on the last act. Führer's orders, resistance to the last round. Some of the battalions moving into strong points along the landward front of Cherbourg had been reduced to 90 to 180 men. If only they still had their heavy anti-aircraft guns, which had proved so effective against tanks. But the guns, including a good many 88 mm ones, had been left behind in their positions. As bad luck would have it, the gun limbers and tractors had been concentrated right in the middle of the American parachutists' dropping zone in the area of Seas. The flak officer responsible had simply abandoned the tractor depot and disengaged himself. The result was disastrous. The 4 weakened combat groups had to defend a 30-mile area around Cherbourg field positions with practically no armour-piercing weapons. The York Peninsula, with its outer strong-point west deck, was held by the 922nd Grenadier Regiment, organised as a combat group. Next, as far as Strongo 463, came the combat group Kale with the 919th Grenadier Regiment and the 17th Machine Gun Battalion. The centre of the line was held by the 739th Grenadier Regiment under Lieutenant Colonel Conn, and the eastern sector from Strongpoint 436 down to Cap Levy was manned by the combat group Roach together with the 729th Grenadier Regiment. The nerve centre of the town's defences and of the landward front was in an underground command post at Octaval, a suburb of Cherbourg. There too was the headquarters of Admiral Henner, the naval commander of Normandy. General von Schlieben realised that there was no hope of prolonged resistance against a modern motorised army. The important thing was to gain time to destroy the harbour so as to make it useless for American unloading operations for a long while to come, and time to enable a German defensive line to be established in the south so as to tie down the enemy forces aiming at Cherbourg for as long as possible. Schlieben spoke frankly to the commanders of his combat groups. "Dig in and hold" was the slogan for the strong points. The men did their best. In the corridors of the underground command headquarters, there was hardly room enough to swing a cat. Nearly 1,000 men were now inhabiting the subterranean galleries, sitting or lying around, stretched out on cases, kit bags and ammunition boxes, sleeping, dozing or cursing irritably. Naval gunners, the crews of harbour patrol boats, building workers of the TOT organisation, men of the Labour Service, and Luftwaffe ground staff. There was a stench of gunpowder, rotting cloth, exhaust fumes from the various motors, and human sweat. The air conditioning system was no longer working. From the gallery exits came the crash of shell bursts. Now and again the electric light would flicker, and a moment later there would be an explosion. A corporal who had found safety in the command bunker, but an hour ago, after his position had been overrun, knew what the bangs were. The Americans had reached the top of the hill above the command post. They were now using enormous drilling rigs to bore holes into the ground, and were filling them with explosives. "If we don't surrender soon, they'll turn us into pulp," he observed challengingly. Lieutenant Bloom, Admiral Henner's orderly officer, was laboriously picking his way to the Situation Room. The situation, of course, was revealed more clearly by conditions within the command post than on the maps. The troops hardly bothered to move their legs out of the way to let the lieutenant pass. That was the measure of their weariness, their battle fatigue, but also their demoralization and recalcitrance. Bloom no longer paid any attention to it. He had just been to the general's command post. His chief of operations had told him enough. There was no hope. In the Situation Room, Bloom was met by Lieutenant Schehorn, aide-de-camp. "What news?" he asked. Bloom shrugged his shoulders. "Fort Duru fell 2 hours ago, so now the Americans on the high ground at the southern edge of the town command every corner of the fortress." Schehorn was shocked. What happened? How could a powerful fort like that fall? Surely that rock fortress with its 150 mm guns was considered impregnable. Bloom shrugged his shoulders again. The Americans had positioned their guns near a field hospital, with his batteries built into the rock and pointing seaward towards the harbour. The commander of the fort could not do anything useful anyway, and he dared not use his automatic weapons for fear of shooting up the hospital. His guns were silenced at point-blank range by hits through the apertures. Sheehorn walked up to the map. "And how long can we hold out in here?" Bloom answered without hesitation. "They've already encircled our hill. They're blocking the southern exit by blasting and are drilling down into the rock above us. From the top, they are also dropping assault charges down our ventilation shafts. These may not hurt us much, but since the air conditioning has packed up, it means that our air is being fouled by nitrous fumes. If they don't blast us out of our burrow, they'll smoke us out." The sub-lieutenant fell silent. The aide-de-camp was silent too. The rumbling of the artillery sounded eerie and evil in this 20th century dungeon. Bloom reached under his desk. "That's the last of it," he said, as he poured out 2 glasses of cognac. Divided from Bloom's situation room by only a few feet of rock and soil, Lieutenant General von Schlieben, the commander of the fortress of Cherbourg and the entire Cherbourg front, was likewise standing in front of his map in his panel room, gazing at the tangle of blue lines and red arrows. The date was Sunday, June 25th, and the time was 3:52 p.m. There was a knock at the door. Major Forer, the chief of operations, entered. In his hand was a slip of paper. "Army Group's reply to our signal. General Schlieben, turn." He said nothing, but his eyes tried to read in Forer's face the decision taken by Army Group in response to the signal he had sent that morning. Enemy superiority in material and enemy domination of the air overwhelming. Most of our own batteries out of ammunition or smashed, troops badly exhausted, confined to the narrowest space, their backs against the sea, harbour and all other important installations effectively destroyed. Loss of the town unavoidable in the nearest future as enemy has already penetrated outskirts, have 2,000 wounded without possibility of moving them. Is there any point in view of the overall situation in having our remaining forces entirely wiped out, as seems inevitable in the absence of effective counter-weapons? Request urgent instructions. Schlieben remembered every word, especially the final question. He had taken some care with Forer to phrase it. Surely they must give him a free hand. "Well," he asked, "what's their reply?" Major Forer read out, "In accordance with the Führer's orders, you are to continue fighting to the last round. Rommel, Field Marshal." "Is that all?" "That is all." Schlieben glanced at the situation map on the wall. He had stared 100 times at the jumble of lines and arrows, and 100 times he had realized the basic fact that the fortress of Cherbourg had its face to the sea. That was the direction in which all the guns of the naval defences of the army, coastal artillery, and of the fortress artillery were facing. That was the direction from which the enemy had been expected. That he might come from behind, from the landward side, had been steadfastly and confidently discounted by the senior German command, in spite of many a warning. They were now about to pay for their mistake. The fate suffered in 1942 by the British in Singapore, the world's strongest naval fortress, was about to befall the Germans at Cherbourg, invasion through the back door. Major Forer and the intelligence officer were entering the latest reports about enemy penetrations on the situation map. Everywhere the red arrows were piercing the blue lines and circles of the German defensive positions, and every intersection by a red arrow represented a tragedy. Many of the strong points and defensive positions were not even connected by telephone. Neighbouring strong points often lacked visual contact with one another over the difficult ground. The ring of interior forts around the city centre were outmoded. Only the 2 newly built outer fortifications, West Sea and East Sea, were modern constructions by the Todt organisation. But even they were inadequately equipped for defence against attack from the landward side. This, then, was Cherbourg's landward front line, a line which might conceivably be held by crack units, but never by the exhausted remnants of 2 infantry divisions and the medley of men without battle experience, airfield ground personnel, Luftwaffe transport units, fortification engineers, elderly naval ratings, the office staff of Field Commandant Tour No. 583, middle-aged paymasters from the fortress's depot, personnel employees of the Labour Service, the TOT organisation, and Georgian battalions. On May 1, 1944, about 5 weeks before the invasion, General Marks had proved in the course of an exercise that the fortress could be overrun from the landward side in a surprise attack. The assault battalion Mrs. Schmid had broken through its defences. It was a piece of tragic irony that the first real enemy penetration was made in exactly the same spot where Marks's assault battalion had broken through in the exercise, at the joint between strong points 422 and 426. The lesson of the manoeuvres had been confirmed by grim reality. And how could it have been otherwise? How could strong points manned by veterinary officers and their St. STS, or by half-trained teenage parachutists, stand up to attacks by enemy armour? The line is carved up. What concentrated gunfire and aerial bombardment had failed to achieve was achieved in next to no time by infantry charges with tank support. The men abandoned their positions and sought safety inside the concrete bunkers of the city. But some strong points resisted fanatically. Thus, 18-year-old men of the Labour Service defended their strong point at Gonville with stubborn courage. The ground was unfavourable, artillery observation was difficult, and the guns could not be brought to bear effectively against the attacking armour. Nevertheless, the young boys stood as firm in their trenches as battle-hardened grenadiers, and even fought the American infantrymen with their spades. But what could they achieve against tanks? They fired their Panzerfausts and bazookas while they had any left, and then put up their hands. But even the experienced combat groups were powerless against the Americans, who were equipped with every conceivable technical means. Keyes' men, the 919th Grenadier Regiment from Hesse and Thuringia, the 17th Machine Gun Battalion, and Müller's combat group of the 922nd. None of them were able to stand their ground. Ken's 739th Grenadiers and Roach's 729th likewise had to yield. Thanks to their material superiority, the American assault regiments simply carved up the front. Lieutenant Colonel Keel reports, "The American attacks on all the strong points, however small, invariably followed the same pattern. First, bombing by 50 aircraft. Second, pasting by mortar fire, then the charge by assault troops. The Americans carried first-rate walkie-talkie sets and reported back immediately on the success or failure of their operation. Before the German company commander was even informed by Runner that the enemy had established himself in one of his strong points, the commander of the American assault force would have called up reinforcements by radio. As soon as they had captured a strong point, they organised themselves for all-round defence and waited for the German counterattack. They then repulsed it and followed up at once. Hours would pass before regimental headquarters got a clear picture of what was happening, and before countermeasures of any scope could even begin to be taken. In the meantime, the same drill would be carried out at some other strong point. In this way, at the cost of a colossal expenditure of material, the German landward front was being crushed and atomized. General von Schleben was thinking of his appointment as fortress commander. By Hitler on June 23rd, the Führer had sent him a telegram. It had contained the sentence, "If the worst is to happen, then Sherborne only as a heap of rubble." A heap of rubble. Schahn stood gazing at the map. It recorded clearly the unrolling of events. On June 20th at 2 p.m, a signal had come from Artillery Group South. Enemy spearhead on Volog-Cherbourg Road has reached southern outpost. Request permission to open fire. Late in the afternoon, towards 5:45 p.m, the Americans reached the landward front on the eastern sector, also near the village of La Tale. They probed the German defences but withdrew again when the salvos of 5th and 8th Batteries, 179th Artillery Regiment, crashed down on the armoured spearheads. That had been the overture. The curtain was rung up on the first act. On the morning of June 21st, an air raid of tremendous force by several waves of 1,000 machines battered the German lines. It was followed by concentrated artillery fire and by attacks from low-flying aircraft. Eventually, the tanks rumbled forward from Saint-Pierre-Aegis. A detachment advanced cautiously towards the airfield at Gaville. Within the area of strong points 410 to 420, Captain Zark, in charge of the 9th Battery, acted as artillery observer in strong point 416, directing the fire of his guns against the American tanks. Direct hit. The tanks turned tails. Presently they came back intent on forcing the breakthrough this time, but they were again unable to get through the barrage of gunfire. Once more they withdrew. However, they succeeded elsewhere. Alarm! The shout went up in strong points 425 and 426. But already the tanks were upon them, having crept up over ground that was difficult to observe. A parachute company composed of young men from a training battalion with only 6 weeks of training and with no fighting experience was overrun. The enemy, as a result, gained a foothold right inside the German lines. True enough, 2nd Lieutenant Cadal of the 729th Grenadiers succeeded in holding strong points 421 and 424 with his company, but what use was that? The American tanks simply drove through the gap at strong point 425. At 4:15 p.m., they were outside the gun position of 2nd Lieutenant Ull's 5th Battery, 1st 161st Artillery Regiment. The regimental battery of the 179th under Lieutenant Bauer had been overrun, and most of his gunners had been killed. The position of 11th Battery under Lieutenant Schalber was defended in fury, hand-to-hand fighting. Gun after gun was eliminated by the tanks. The horses in the transport park were mown down. Lieutenant Schalber, though wounded, reached the Ostsee fort and made his report. Artillery reconnaissance parties of 8th, 10th and 11th batteries entered the threatened area. They reported back, "Enemy spearheads with armoured support have already reached the Cherbourg-Tavel main road west of the airfield. 2nd Lieutenant Cadal is still holding out in the main line, apart from the gap torn into it at strong point 425. The main line is still intact. Captain Walter, with his 8th Battery, 179th Artillery Regiment, is encircled by the enemy and has organised all-round defence. It was the great hour of the artillery. The infantry's counterattacks were supported by concentrated gunfire. Every barrel was firing to capacity. As if by a miracle, the field telephone lines to the encircled 8th Battery, running through the switchboard of the overrun regimental battery, had remained intact. The unmanned exchange, with the connections set for fire control, thus continued to function. In a sunken lane, which had long since been captured by the enemy, "Hang on," was the message the men of the 8th Battery heard again and again, and they hung on. Lieutenant Frey, with a battalion of the 729th Grenadier Regiment, fought his way right up to the battery in a surprise counterattack. Corporal Rule knocked out 2 enemy tanks with his Panzerfaust. The Americans opened fire with phosphorus shells, but 8th Battery, encircled from 3 sides, held out in vain. Frey tried to seal off the lost strong points 423 to 425. Captain Holman, repeating the attempt with a parachute company, was no more successful. The danger persisted for another 3 days. 8th Battery stood its ground. Then the position had to be abandoned. They blew up their guns. The crews by then had been reduced to 22 men. All that was reflected on the situation map in General Shan's command post, in straight and curved arrows, in discontinuous and dotted lines, in conventional tactical signs for batteries, regiments, companies, headquarters, and all kinds of units. The great battle was transformed here into an abstract mural, but for anyone who knew how to read it, each line was pregnant with life and death. On June 22nd, the Americans forced deep penetrations into the western and southern parts of the front. By June 23rd, Major General Collins's assault regiments had driven 4 wedges into the German defences. The main German line collapsed in many places in the areas of all 4 German combat groups. American tanks were striking at artillery positions now forced to defend themselves from all directions. On June 24th, the enemy had established himself in the suburbs of Tville and Octaval and at the Fort Douro. Thus, the underground command bunker of Scharn, Henner and the artillery commander Ritter found themselves within the immediate combat zone. Captain crosses the lines on June 25th. Towards 10 a.m., a squadron of enemy warships appeared off the fortress, just as if they were taking part in a naval exercise. Battleships, cruisers and destroyers. Sherborne. The harbour commandant sat behind the vision slits of the concrete bunker, which looked almost like the bridge of a cruiser. "Lattice masts," he said, his eyes glued to the telescope. That meant battleships of an older American type. Now the fleet opened fire. Out of a wall of smoke and fumes, the salvos came roaring over. Not since the Battle of Jutland had we seen a squadron in action with all its guns blazing. Fascinated, he watched the spectacle. In any event, that was all he could do. The units were keeping well out of range of his 150 mm battery in Fort Homat. The shells churned up the ground. Direct hits in the Fort de Flamand, stocks of ammunition going up, big fires. The squadron sailed up and down in front of the fortress, east of the harbour. It came a little closer inshore. Surely Hamburg Battery ought to be able to get them now, Witt was thinking. At the same instant he could see the muzzle flashes. The heavy coastal batteries, York, Bromley and Hamburg, were firing at the American naval units. York Battery scored hits on Texas, on a light cruiser and on a destroyer. At the Hamburg Battery, Lieutenant Gelhar opened up with his 4 240 mm guns and scored hits aboard 2 cruisers of the Cumberland class. True, the British Admiralty denied the loss of a cruiser, as assumed on the German side. But there were plenty of witnesses to confirm that highly effective direct hits had been scored, including Army coastal artillery officers, who would certainly be the last persons to credit the naval gunners with any unearned success. According to information released by the United States Navy Department on March 4, 1954, the German batteries engaging in duel with the Allied naval force scored direct hits on His Majesty's ship Glasgow, United States ship Texas, United States ship Bryan, United States ship Bonn, and United States ship Laffey. Towards 12 p.m., the Allied squadron withdrew beyond the range of the German coastal batteries. Mass formations of lightning bombers came screaming over to attack the German gun positions. By grid pattern fire, the naval fortress guns and the flak between them succeeded in shooting down 80 aircraft. An hour later, Sean's intelligence officer made a highly significant entry on his situation map. Fort Deru had fallen. It was obvious at a glance that the approach roads from the south were no longer covered. They were open to the enemy. The town and harbour had become a prize ready to be plucked by the Americans. Their heavy artillery was pounding the encircled heights of the suburb of Octaval, below which lay the network of subterranean bunkers that housed the German command posts. American engineers were trying to blast these command posts and thus paralyze the nerve centre of the German defence. That was the moment when Sean had sent out his urgent signal into the ether, asking the higher command whether there was still any need for the destruction of such forces as remained.